I think the sound was me, so I guess that means we get started. Hello again and welcome everyone to our third panel today. I'm Hannah Pfeiffer, and together with Irene Weipert-Fenne, I have organized a panel on temporality and the dynamics of trust in conflicts, illustrations from the MENA region. Could you please start our PowerPoint? So maybe let me already get started by asking, why do we organize a panel on temporality? So luckily for us, we have three excellent colleagues with us who have been working on trust in the MENA for a while now. And we asked them to actually reflect on this aspect of temporality. And let me start by looking at some desiderata that we have with regard to trust research. So what do we know and what do we have? So there are a lot of quantitative studies on trust, especially in the West and especially in democratic and peaceful contexts. We also know quite some bit on the relation between different forms of trust, more specifically social and political trust. And through surveys, we have been measuring levels of trust, and we can also look at how they evolve over time. And more specifically, there's even some literature on levels of trust in post-conflict contexts, especially with regard to social trust. And there are some studies on trust in the Middle East. And these studies are mainly from our panelists. For instance, there are analyses of trust before and after protest, among others by Niels. There are studies on trust and unsuccessful and successful transitions to democracy, among others by Yasmin. And we have a whole book on trust in divided societies by ABdalhadi, who is also here. We have already discussed it a bit in one of the breaks, that there are less studies on political trust in this region and on, more generally speaking, on political trust in conflict and post-conflict settings. So what are we missing in the literature? First of all, we think that the MENA region is generally underrepresented. And then the question is, of course, whether concepts that we use for the study of trust in democratic and peaceful contexts actually travel that easily. We've already heard in previous panels that one question is, depending on context, whether trust is always desirable. So for instance, there is this debate with regard to the MENA that trust in the context of authoritarian systems can actually be harmful. And of course, we have the MENA region is full of armed conflict, non-armed conflict, contentious politics. So this also changes the setting. We also think that trust dynamics in such contexts of extreme uncertainty are under-researched, and we also have some contradictory findings of quantitative studies. So actually, protest in conflict may both increase and decrease different forms of trust. So we are wondering, how exactly does trust form and or get destroyed during phases of conflict or mass protest? And we want to zoom in on this and look at the micro-temporality of how trust evolves. And we also wonder how these processes relate to larger, long-term political and social developments and formations. And this would be what we call macro-temporality. Now, what do we suggest? We call the situation we're dealing with trust under conditions of extreme uncertainty, and we would like to advance trust research through the study of armed conflict and protest. So Rainer Voss has just joined us here in presence in the conference, and we have also heard about his suggestion for a relational dynamic concept and then also more specific conceptions of trust. A trusts C in context C in relation to D, reiteratively in a process of experiences that influences A. Now we want to combine this concept with what we think is a disaggregation agenda in the study of contentious politics and armed conflict. So this disaggregation agenda concerns, first of all, actors, especially the state, but then also processes, especially with regard to fractures and continuities between the conflict phase and the pre- and post-conflict. I've worked on this a bit with Regine Schwab, who hopefully sees us online, a dear colleague of ours. And then finally, there's also a call for spatial and temporal disaggregation, which we think will help us in also advancing the study of trust, especially, of course, with regard to temporality. And we have also heard about this already in earlier talks and comments today, that the political side of trust should also be analyzed. So in the Brexit paper, we have heard about this a bit. So the question of agency and the politics of trust building or trust destruction from below and from above, what we could call maybe trust engineering. So basically, in this relational approach, what we aim to do is to look at different A's and different B's, how they evolve in different contexts, for instance, different spatial and temporal contexts in relation to different D's. And we've also heard that there, like trust, distrust, and mistrust always exist simultaneously. Now, what we present to you is based on two projects that we work on. So the first looks at how different actors attempt to destroy previously existent as well as rebuild new epistemic authority and trust in the context of armed conflict in Iraq. So this is the project that I'm working on in ConTrust. And then here trust would be understood as a population in a certain territory trusts a certain epistemic authority in a context of changing and violently contested rule with regard to an interpersonally transmitted piece of new information or knowledge. And this is the first project. And the second one is Irene's project on trust in protests in the MENA. When and how do people in mass protests overcome identity-related divisions through cooperation and calls for overcoming these cleavages on the social and political level? And the conception of trust here would be protesters trust social actors in a context of contentious politics and mass protest with regard to cross-cleavage cooperation. And now Irene will go a bit more into depth and tell you about how we aim to do this.
Thank you, Hannah. Good afternoon to you all. Yes, so I have the pleasure now to spell out a bit what this could mean in actually in our research, both on a theoretical conceptual side as well as the implications for methodological questions and challenges. So first of all, as Hannah pointed out, we want to talk about or analyze temporality at the micro level. So trust, we have discussed this before, can both erode and grow in conflicts. Particularly from the ConTrust perspective, we're interested in a counterintuitive increase of trust during conflicts in the context of extreme uncertainty, as of course violent conflicts are, but also mass protests, most of them anti-regime protests and autocracies that I consider moments and episodes of extreme uncertainty. So the interesting thing is, so we're bringing together two research projects and trying to get some synergies from conceptualizations we have done independently from each other. For instance, for violent conflict, Hannah talks about a nucleus of trust building in regard to epistemic trust and legitimation projects in violent order making. So it's an idea of a nucleus, so something that could start where trust could grow from. And I had a similar idea when I theorized about mass protests in the MENA that increasingly overcame social divisions to think that this was a step-by-step process that started with intensified trust relations that were built during protests and during contention also with state actors, etc., the disaggregation agenda that Hannah pointed out before. So I call this islands of trust. So this is the beginning of bigger trust dynamics that you then can observe, and I also think of it as a spiral of trust that have increased trust levels while the protest, or then in Hannah's case, maybe the violent conflict unfolds. So this is when we look at the micro level. But we also talked about the macro level, and of course the challenge is to combine both. So when we think about more like a long-term diachronic view on our process that we are interested in. For Hannah, this means to study continuities and changes from pre to conflict to post-conflict phases at different stages in the cycle of rebel governance. For me, I even go a step back even further, and I look at the origins and transformations of cleavages in MENA. And I theorize here on, based on a constructivist take on cleavages, and think that we really need to understand where they come from. I mean ethnic, religious, and interreligious cleavages, but also socioeconomic cleavages that date back and relate to colonialism, decolonization, independence, but also neoliberalism. But again, this is not about having a structural determinism in here that agents just have to deal with, but we see agency in these trust relations at the micro and the macro level as crucial. And the idea is then to link the micro level and the actions that we see in trust building to the macro level, also from the actors' perspectives, how cleavages, for instance, are reinterpreted, how the relation to epistemic authorities is reinterpreted, also based on the experiences made earlier. Great that we have a lot to do, but the question is, how should we do this? As Hannah pointed out, most of the trust research is based on surveys, and it's not to say that surveys are wrong per se. On the contrary, I think we need kind of cooperation here, but the thing is really, how can we go beyond surveys? And the methods that I suggest here are not super exciting at first, but they are quite challenging. So first of all, we can do interviews, right? With participants, observers, etc. We can do focus groups, we can engage in document analysis, and there are of course also ethnographic methods to get to everyday life and social practices in regard to trust in violent conflict, but also during protests, particularly as we see a trend in mass protests that seem to last longer and longer. But the challenges are there, and they're quite numerous, I have to say. So first of all, how do we look for trust? How do we know that trust is there? So surveys usually, most of them, ask for trust. So do you trust X, Y, Z, a particular institution, a person? The question is, just envision an interview situation. Would you just open it with saying, do you trust X, Y, Z? Or is it rather that we talk about trust once trust is in crisis? So how would we actually observe or ask for trust when trust relations are good? So we suggested that we need to think about indirect indicators, proxies for trust, which of course have to relate to our definition of trust and what kind of behavior, what kind of attitudes we would then categorize as trust. The second challenge is particularly when we research either violent conflicts of the past or protests of the past, how do we deal with the retrospective bias that might come up? Because, of course, trust assessments will be influenced by experiences made after the episode that we are interested in. Again, I think this relates clearly to the interview techniques that we apply, how to make sure that the person is brought back to this very specific point in time. And as I mentioned earlier, processes will unfold in stages potentially, so we will really need to take the interview back to these different stages by giving, hints to specific turning points, and so maybe either particular training or so must be needed, to really think about how we could really get back to the original trust assessment of a particular point in time. And then, of course, with the extreme uncertainty comes the different access to the field, particularly for ethnographic field work. As you can see, there's a lot more to discuss, and we will do so with our excellent panelists today. And as Hannah mentioned them briefly, I will introduce them to you now for you to understand we really gathered excellent scholars who have worked on trust from different disciplines, fields, methodological approaches as well. So the first speaker after us will be Jasmin Lorch, who is a postdoctoral fellow with the Annemarie Schimmel Scholarship at the Willy Brandt School of Public Policy at the University of Erfurt. Before, she was a research fellow at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, the GIGA in Hamburg, and earlier at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, the SWP in Berlin. She holds a PhD in political science from the University of Freiburg. So Jasmin has researched, published widely on the role of civil society in weak states and in processes of democratization and autocratization. She has also written extensively about Islamism, political Salafism, and secular Islamist relations in South and Southeast Asia and the Maghreb. The second speaker is ABdalhadi Alijla, who is a social and political scientist and science advocate. He is the author of Trust in Divided Societies, as Hannah mentioned before. ABdalhadi is a non-resident research associate at the Center for Social Sciences and Actions in Beirut, Lebanon, and the co-leader of Global Migration and Human Rights at the Global Young Academy. He's an associate researcher and the regional manager of Varieties of Democracy Institute at Gothenburg University for Gulf countries. Our third speaker is Niels Bierings. He's an associate professor in sociology at Radboud University in Nijmegen, the Netherlands. His work focuses on political and social inclusion and exclusion. Currently, he leads a multi-year project on Islamic religiosity and inclusion in Europe, which partly builds on his earlier work on political and social attitudes in the MENA. Methodology-wise, he also publishes on combining feminist and intersectional perspective and quantitative methods. And our papers will be discussed by Jonas Wolf. He's head of Research Department 4 in Interstate Conflict here at PRIF, member of the executive board and professor of political science at Goethe University, Frankfurt. He's also an associate member of ConTrust, Trust in Conflict, of our joint research initiative. His regional focus is usually Latin America, but he is working with me on a project on the MENA for 8 years now, so he's actually an expert now on the MENA as well, and on transformation of political orders, contentious politics, international democracy promotion as well. So very much looking forward to your presentations now and comments.
Our next speaker will be ABdalhadi Alijla. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I will try to stick to the 10 minutes as much as I can. Thank you. My presentation, I don't have presentation, by the way, and I will talk about the Syrian case. But before the Syrian case, my presentation will focus on 3 points. One is why the MENA region and what is happening to the research on trust there. The second point is about the trust in divided societies. What kind of things I learned and we could learn from the MENA region. And the third point is about the case of Syria. And of course, I have heard in the morning and afternoon as well, the second panel, a lot of things that can be compatible and could support the argument, and also the findings of my research could give a hand to the some of the comments. As Hannah said before, that there is a lack of a quantitative data, quantitative analysis in the Middle East. Very rare in the last 10 years. There have been some of the researchers who are originated from the MENA region doing quantitative research. Personally, I know very, very few, less than 5 people from the MENA region, and it's getting quite a good number nowadays that researchers from the West, mainly from the European and American universities who specialize in the MENA region started to use the Arab Barometer. The Arab Barometer, it just started in 2007 and or 2006, and every 2-3 years they update their own wave. Before that, there hasn't been any kind of data, and still until today, for example, it's forbidden to collect data on many regions like Saudi Arabia, like the Emirate. It's totally forbidden to collect data and conduct research. Qatar, they collect research based on their own think tanks. They don't publish the data, but they just do that for themselves. But of course, any data need to be verified. So also the old generations of the Middle East researchers, they mostly skeptical of numbers. They mostly educated with the classical research curricula, so statistics doesn't make sense for them, mostly qualitative. And we still suffer from this as MENA region, but also when we, like Western researchers, go to the Middle East and ask those old generations, they would like, no, qualitative is much better. Which I sometimes I understand that there is a need to understand the context of collecting these kind of quantitative data. The next point on this is the why contradictory findings in some. Quite interesting that there are some contradictory findings when it comes to the trust in the MENA region. And I could say that it could be the same in Latin America. There are some research in Latin America, they have some contradictory findings as well. And this has happened because we have also the causality. The mechanism and the causality, which one goes first? Which, for example, I can give you an example. Does institutional trust create generalized trust? Or does it the other way around? Does high generalized trust create institutional trust? It could be, so this is one thing. The second one, which come before? The corruption or generalized trust? Or corruption or institutional trust? Or generalized trust or institutional trust come before corruption, I mean the low level of trust. So these kind of contradictions need to be understood as in the context, within the context itself. And also it gives us the one of the important aspects that I realized that different countries, divided societies, different divided societies in the MENA and also beyond the MENA, like in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Macedonia, in Pakistan, in Turkey, in South Africa, the outcome of having high level of generalized trust or low level of generalized trust is not identical. Every society has different determinants, institutional and societal determinants that define this kind of outcome. And here, to start with, why generalized trust in divided societies? And well, this is always in reply when it comes to the culture theory also. This is my second point in the presentation, but also it's a continuation of what Hannah said about the institutions and trust. Well, because most of researchers who studied in trust, they always used culture theory to study trust in these Middle Eastern societies. They usually argue, oh, that's because their own society is like that. It's the culture itself. But it's not true. Why, for example, divided society in Iraq or Lebanon is low, for example, they are divided, but also in the Netherlands, it's a divided society. The Belgian is a divided society, but it has high level of generalized trust. And that's where it comes. And I start with the novel of Snezana Mulic, a Bosnian Croatian writer, when she talk about those 4 guys come back from diaspora after they became refugees. After 10 years, they came back to their home in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and then they started to fight again, even though they were neighbors in Germany and Sweden, and they met with each other before. And that's because of the machinery of institutions in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It didn't help. There was a complexity in the bureaucratic machine. The re-engineering and reconfiguration of these institutions in post-conflict time, it didn't reflect the new change, the new realities, and the new aspirations of the society. And here it's in post-conflict societies, the generation and the destruction of trust, social trust or generalized trust, is very complex and complicated. It has to do with the aspirations of the people because they wanted to coexist, and based on that, they needed to be treated equally, the fair and equal public institutions, and also the preferences of public administrations and institutional determinants should meet at least the minimum for everybody in the society. It's one note here is that the destruction of social trust is much easier than building social trust. You could destroy the trust in just a few weeks or a few days, but it will need you years and years to rebuild this trust. And that's one of the outcomes that usually policymakers, when it comes to international development, they don't take into consideration, and that would be difficult. So evidence here is that a well-functioning and high-quality governing mechanism and institutions is central to elevate and to build level of generalized trust. And that's means that the culture theory of that explains generalized trust is usually not the same. It's not. It can have some impact, but it's not the main driving force that's usually working in the Middle East. It's institutions. To have equal, to have trust in the institutions, to have trust in the civil society organizations, to have trust in the judicial system in these societies is very crucial. To feel safe and secured in the society is one of the main driving forces in almost all these societies. My last intervention here, when it comes to in 2 minutes, to Syria. In Syria, usually people argue the case of Syria is that Syria didn't had trust before the war. Well, Syria didn't have trust to start with. I mean, the people in Syria didn't have generalized, didn't have high level. Of course, we don't have the quantitative measurements of the Syrian society in general. It was sectarianized and secularized from the beginning. People were skeptical of their own brothers because the Syrian intelligence was so much embedded within the whole society. So the seller of the kayak of the bread on every day, he is working for the intelligence. That could be your brother. And that's why I usually argue that there wasn't to start with a high level of trust in Syria. And because of the authoritarian measures, authoritarianism usually doesn't like to have trust in the society, because to have trust in the society means that the level of cooperation between the individuals could lead to collective mobilization. And the last point here is when we could measure during the first few years of the civil war in Syria, and after that we could see that there is a correlation and positive relationship between the level of violence from one side and the level of destruction in the level of generalized trust in Syria. And this explains why in many areas where they were exposed to huge amount of violence, and violence not only from the state but also from the rebels and from the different militias in the Syria. Also, the other point here was my last, I promise, the demographic change, which usually it's absent from the arguments from the news, that in Syria there has been a process of demographic change. The Shia are moved from one place to another. The Sunni were moved from one place to another. The Alawite, the Christians, the Kurds, and this kind of, which is I usually they call it a population swap, which is a crime under international law. People created a level of distrust. Like imagine somebody is coming to have your home, and the other going to another village to have the other one home. They used to live together. That's one of the main reasons why Syria doesn't have a trust. Of course, well, I don't need to mention that the absence of CSOs in Syria was totally absent. It didn't create a room to create generalized trust. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Abdalhadi. And we now hear ending of your talk. We now invite Jonas for the discussion of the papers. I have a small announcement, so it might be that I get an email that I have to step out for an important meeting. This is not a comment to Jonas's comments, or that I'm trying to escape his comments. He already knows about that, so just to make sure you also know this. Jonas, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks so much for these papers and presentations. For those of you who haven't had the chance to read them, these are really for super rich think pieces. In this case, really think pieces. I think you all got it with these also very rich presentations. So there would be much to discuss for me, but I promised to be very brief. And because we're talking here about trust, etc., I'm very trustworthy as a discussant, and will try to keep to this promise. And therefore, my decision was to really kind of force myself to focus on only one theme, and this is the theme of this panel, which is the question of temporality. And this also allows me to kind of avoid, to kind of expose my still lack of the MENA region, unfortunately, even with 8 years of participating in this project. Anyway, question of temporality. So what I did was kind of looking through the papers, and now again hearing, of course, the presentations, and trying to identify the kind of arguments and observations and propositions that have been made with a view to this question of temporality when it comes to trust and then, of course, conflict. So Hannah and Irene in the think piece, they make this claim, and I just quote this briefly: studying temporal dynamics of trust opens a whole new perspective on social and political conflict. And when reading this, I was wondering, like, you could understand this phrase or this proposition in two ways, right? One would rather, like, forget about the temporal and just say that studying dynamics of trust is important for studying social and political conflict, and this is, of course, a very important statement, but not kind of one specifically about temporality. And the other interpretation, which I think would be important for this panel, that it's really the temporality of this, the temporality of trust, not only looking at trust and taking it seriously, but really conceiving of trust as a somehow temporal feature, or affected by temporality, that is key if we want to understand social and political conflict. So this is kind of the more specific question I've tried to struggle with, and I have no answer, and I'm only the commentator, so you have to give the answers afterwards. I just want to push you a bit to perhaps speak even a bit more explicitly about this and reflect about this issue of temporality. I think, like, to start with, all the authors of these think pieces and the speakers agree on one, I think, crucial point about temporality and why it matters, and this is that trust and distrust and mistrust evolves over time. So it's not kind of a constant feature, as does, of course, conflict. And so it grows and deteriorates, it is built, it is destroyed, etc. And this is, of course, very crucial, but it's also, of course, fairly obvious, if you will, and it's also a very general observation. We could make, of course, this claim to any kind of social phenomenon we want to study, that all of these phenomena are just not constant, but they evolve and change over time, and therefore also the relationship between trust and conflict also. Then there's the theoretically a bit more specific argument, which also I think is important, about this kind of type of temporality, which is kind of connected to arguments that have been explicit in the paper, not so much in the presentations, about path dependencies, questions of legacies, etc. So these kinds of neo-institutionalists argument that it's not only that kind of this evolution is kind of relevant to take into consideration, but it's also therefore particularly important because kind of the past and the different past states of trust and of conflict, of course, kind of have lasting impact on our present and on the future, and we can kind of and have to study this and take it seriously. And this, of course, in particular when it comes to the kind of transitions that are discussed in the papers from pre-conflict, conflict to post-conflict kind of transitions, or kind of democratic transitions, and all these kind of stages where you really have kind of important institutional change, and then you want to look at these kind of legacies and past dependencies. Then there's a very different type of argument that has been made most explicitly by Niels now at the end, which concerns us as scholars, of course. So the temporality of our own kind of way of looking at these things, so that basically our scholarly lenses, theoretical, conceptual, methodological, normative, etc., also change over time, as so to speak, time-bound themselves, and this is important to reflect upon. We also had this kind of from a more of a methodological kind of perspective in Yasmin's presentation, where she talked about we want to know something now about trust a few years ago, and we now ask people, and so we have to consider this, that we look at this also as scholars at a particular moment in time. So important point, but again, I think something that is not very specific about trust. Again, we could make this argument, and we should make this argument with a view to all types of scholarly endeavors we are engaged in. Then this was presented, and this relates to, again, the first way of looking at temporality. So the thing that the observation that, well, trust changes over time and conflict, etc. So this important distinction between kind of the micro-temporality and the macro-temporality. So this is a kind of way of kind of having two different, if you will, approaches to this very kind of first type of temporality, right? Looking more at the microdynamic, the sequences of events, even the interpersonal interactions between specific actors or even individuals. These notions that kind of trust, something happens interestingly within certain islands of trust or a given nucleus, etc. And then kind of at the macro level, what has been called macro-temporality, so the more kind of long-term developments, the more broader kind of shifts in institutional settings or from different conflict phases or regime change at the more aggregate level, where you then have in the papers kind of virtuous cycles, vicious cycles, the interplay between institutions and trust at this kind of macro level, and all of the think pieces really highlight this. And I think this is a very helpful distinction. Of course, a key question then is how they relate. Of course, how kind of these microdynamics kind of have an impact on the macro level and the other way around. But I would think, like in this attempt to push you a bit further, kind of to consider this question of temporality, still say this is still kind of a fairly kind of a general argument that we would have to look at the micro and the macro level. So I was wondering, and I'm almost about to stop, whether there might not be something more specific about the temporality of trust, and I just came up with two thoughts in this regard. How we could think this. The first, and there are kind of hints here and there in the think pieces and in the presentations. The first idea about this question of a specific temporality of trust would kind of ask whether trust as a phenomena has a specific temporality that is somehow different from other social phenomena, right? And there are interesting kind of hints there in the overall, I think, research on trust. We heard this also in previous panels, this argument that, how was it with, I think Dirk was it, that trust is built over long periods of time and then it kind of can erode quite quickly. So this is a temporal argument, right? Which somehow suggests that there's something specific about this temporality, right? And I think in the broader research, you do find this debate whether, and you find kind of contrasting arguments that trust might be something particularly stable, so almost timeless, right? It's more kind of it's a result of processes of socialization in childhood, etc. And then you have fairly stable kind of levels of trust, if you will, in individuals over long periods of time, no matter what happens. Not precisely, of course, things change, but in contrast to other kinds of phenomena, perhaps a rather stable one, or even societies which over long kind of decades, like region trust research on Latin America versus MENA versus Europe. So with all kind of most important changes that you can see, you have kind of some kind of consistent features when it comes to general levels of social or political trust. No matter all kinds of changes, which might suggest that there's something not timeless. This is kind of too much, but a specific kind of long-term temporality of trust. And you have kind of the opposite argument, which is, I think, also important, this kind of argument that it can erode quite quickly. So it's something that can be lost quite quickly. And also, we had this also previously, and we have this also in the think pieces, kind of examples where kind of also trust can be gained quite quickly in kind of a very specific interaction and situation. So I think this would be really an important kind of question for me when it comes to this temporality question. And of course, then we had all kinds of conceptual discussions already. It might well be that different types of trust have different specific temporalities, right? When it comes to the more kind of interpersonal, more social trust that is perhaps more reflective of processes of socialization, which might be more timeless and more stable, whereas perhaps institutional political trust, which is more experience-based and can be kind of eroded very quickly, is more kind of time-bound a phenomenon. Or like the distinction from previous panels, that kind of the more emotion-based trust is perhaps, this is just a proposition, more stable, right? Because it's based on other kind of dynamics. It's much more kind of a learned and not that much not that much kind of consciously reflected phenomenon. Whereas perhaps the calculated trust can change quite quickly because just the situation has to kind of change, and then kind of the game. And therefore the calculus changes, right? So I think this would be something I would like to hear more about from the speakers, from their respective research and perspectives, what they think about this. And then kind of, and I close with this. Okay, I'm already talking too long, but just very briefly. Following up on Niels' argument, but now with a view to temporality, I was wondering whether the very conception of temporality might also have this type of a bias that Niels highlighted, right? So is kind of our notion of temporality as kind of something linear. We tend to see it also as something progressive, also a specific conception of temporality, and might there also be other conceptions of temporality which might make this a story even more complicated? And I'll leave it here and look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, excellent. Many thanks, Jonas, for these great comments that push us to go further. Quite a few meters, I have to say. So this was very helpful. Thanks a lot. As time has progressed already, I would suggest to collect questions now. Anyone in the room who would like to ask a question or comment on what has been just said? Or yes, please. Could we get a microphone, please?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for the talks and the discussion points. It was really nice to hear. I was wondering about the methodological approaches like that were mentioned in the first presentation, and I kind of picked upon kind of mixed signals, at least for me, on what kind of methods you would like to see and you think the field needs to kind of push your knowledge further. So on the one hand, you kind of made a claim to make use of more qualitative approaches, and on the other hand, I think I also heard that the type of quantitative literature, so the surveys we do have, are also limited in a way. So I was wondering what type of questions you think we need to answer with certain methods, also with respect to temporality. So just curious about your thoughts in that respect.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions in the room? Yeah, Vincent Seliger, please.
Yeah, thanks. That was a fantastic panel. I have a lot of questions rolling around my head, but maybe 3 brief points. Irene, you were talking about islands of trust, and that also applies to situations of asymmetrical warfare, as I understood it.
Yeah, that's the nucleus of trust. But yeah,
Or, yeah, yeah. I was thinking about stories dating back to the Algerian War and the specific role that French doctors and providers of medical services played in that conflict, where they sort of occupied a neutral territory, which, you know, in conventional warfare is catered for through the Red Cross services, but in asymmetrical warfare, those rules don't necessarily apply. And so you have a sort of civil society institutions coming into play and creating something like islands of trust that in the armed conflict create a neutral position. So I was just thinking about that and wondering how that factored into it. And ABdalhadi, what struck me with your presentation is the fact that the government of Qatar does statistics but doesn't publish them. Whereas in Western liberal democracy, producing data and making them available is actually a way of generating generalized institutional trust. So I was just wondering if you could comment more on that, because it says a lot about how governments view the public or define citizenship and trust relations or distrust, mistrust relations with a view to governance. And finally, Niels, that was very stimulating. I was going to ask some of the questions that you asked, but still, I just want to reiterate what I think is your main point, namely how many temporalities are there, both with regards to our positions as researchers and also with regards to what different types of temporality may mean for different types of conceptions of trust. So yeah, that's more of a remark and a question. And now on to Rainer.
If I may, is there time for another question?
Absolutely.
Okay, so since the mic is already in this row, I may as well. Thanks so much for a great panel. And forgive me the general question to all of you. If I try to summarize a common theme, it seems to be that you argue against locating the sources of trust in common identity and common culture, but rather in some way or another suggest a materialist approach. The two experiences, and correct me if I'm wrong, the two experiences that lead to trust is, as Dr. Alijla said, the experience of security that the other, as you experience despite conflict, is not seen as a threat to the essential security you think is important. And in Irene, it is the experience of sharing aims despite difference, because you have a common enemy or you have a common object of what you struggle against. And I thought the secular and Islamic elites could be analyzed along similar lines. There are certain material interests which, if they are not threatened and maybe even furthered, generate trust. So are you all materialists about trusts, and how Hobbesian are you? Which is not to say that this is bad, right? I just throw in, this is how Hobbes thought trust arises.
Great, a provocative question. Not in the end, but Tobias, yes, please, absolutely.
Well, yeah, thank you for this fantastic panel. So Jonas has been pushing all of you to reflect a bit on what you actually mean by temporality and what's specific about temporality when we talk about trust. And something that I'd expected when I saw the title of the panel actually is that it was also about the specific way in which someone relates to the future when one trusts. So basically this leap of faith, this kind of acting as if the future was certain. And so I think my question for all of you would be whether you see a specific quality of how the future is practiced in these contexts you study, in mass protests, in context of intense violence and so on. Because I think that's a very important way how a specific form of temporality actually features in trust dynamics and conflict dynamics.
Great, thank you. I would take a last question, if there is any. If not, as Hannah, as you said before, had to leave right now, but she might be back pretty soon, I would suggest that we go like now from the other order, starting with Niels again, if this is okay, and just work our way back forth.
I was kind of counting on being lost.
Sorry for that.
Wow, I'll keep it short. I love how you sort of also summarized, but also classified the different ways in which we all approach temporality, and we just got yet another form, I think, in how it can work out. And if I would relate to that, I think thinking about the future and how people perceive the future, that is actually part of several of the explanations in different papers I use in terms of expectations. So what do people expect from the institutional changes? But that is in the theory and the mechanisms, not so much in the measurement, but that would be great to include in the measurements as well. There's so much I would like to respond to. One of the things that I wouldn't say I'm purely a materialist or Hobbesian, but I do think, and I'm curious how other panelists experience that, is that we often have to argue against the culturalist argument, because it's always about the Muslims or Muslim civilization against the civilized, rational West, and the MENA is not rational, is irrational. So sort of talking about irrational arguments, the role of emotions, is a bit tricky in this context. But I definitely wouldn't say it's fully materialist, but I do think there's a lot of rational considerations going on among the general population, because people can think. Let me just stop there and that we continue, otherwise I will take all the time, and that gives me some time to think about other comments.
Thank you. So much to unpack here, but I will start from the where did you end here about and start from there, the methodology. And I think the way to go forward with this is to not focus only on quantitative data, because it's usually, when I read some papers done only quantitatively by non-Arabs or non-scholars from none from the MENA region, or haven't lived there for a long time, 10 years or plus, you could find that there is a lot of fallacy there. They didn't understand the context of this. And that's 2 or 3 ways to do that. One is to have a mixed research approach. Second is to always collaborate with co-authors from the region who could give a hand on this. So this is my opinion. Then about the Qatar. Well, Qatar has 2 basic institutions that conduct value survey. One is the Arab Center. It's run by Azmi Bishara. Sorry if he is hearing us. And the second one is at Qatar University. But they collect these data and they don't publish the raw material. They select specific questions and then publish them. I personally have asked them many times that I need these data for the population, so I want to see how it works. And they was like, no. So this is, I'm not saying that they are manipulating data, but in many contexts, in my experience in the Middle East, some of the data are manipulated, especially when it comes to the United Arab Emirates. They publish their own surveys on the MENA region, but there is no data. And they don't announce who are the collaborative institutions there who conducted these data. So there is that's the situation there. The third point is about, I am not materialist. Of course, we need to consider trust as a virtue, as a norm, as a value, and that's why there is always islands of a trust. I give you example in Iraq and in many of the MENA regions, in the tribes, among the tribes, the Bedouin, the level of high trust, it exceeds the highest in the West, because they have an informal code of conduct that if any member of these tribes breach this or violate this conduct, it's a shame, it's the highest level of shame that that this person is bringing to the whole tribe. And that's why they are very, very careful. I give you an example. If you buy a car from from a different tribe who live in the same region, in same area, then the word is the contract. And if you violate this contract, then it would be a big deal that you are bringing a shame for the whole tribe. This is an example, and this is a simple one. So there is non-materials, but what I argue here is that the institutions matters as a source for generalized trust. And we always argue against the culturist, the Orientalist in a negative way, who always argue, oh, it's the Middle East. Okay, so what? Exceptionalism of the Middle East, always it has to do from, or come from the culture. That's what we always argue. We need to study the Middle East and the trust in the Middle East from this perception. About temporality, which is the last one, I think this is amazing way to put it, and I have always thought, how could we do that? How we measure that? And that's the difficult question. Nobody, for example, expected in November 29 that the Lebanese will have a kind of uprising there. But if before that, the level of trust in Lebanon was already around, it was like 80%, 82% distrust among the society. But during that 2 months of uprising, it went up because the people were mobilized. They felt that they are doing something great. But when it failed a few months later, it went to 92. That is trust. And that's what the temporality, it's a changing, it's a dynamic. But the continuity of the same institutions, it will affect and it will lead to the worst level of distrust. But this is, of course, it needs a lot of resources to conduct these kind of things.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, thanks a lot. Three brief points. I mean, first to Jonas, I spent the last 10 minutes trying to disentangle, I guess, temporality and speed. Like how do the two relate and how do they need to be separated? But I do think that it's very important, you said it's very important, that it matters, temporality or speed. It's different depending on the type of trust. Like in my case, it was just about, did they trust the other side to negotiate honestly in this situation? Did they both want to prevent this situation? And this is also, it was at a very specific point in time, and also the trust was very specific, very limited, I think, to certain aspects, and this is also why it could be fast in a way. And then perhaps relatedly, like the Hobbesian materialist aspect, I mean, I completely agree with what has already been said, like the debate on Orientalism, and that we shouldn't overstress culturalistic features. But here as well, I was a bit, or we were a bit already guided by our definition, because it was about did they view the other side of as being ready to keep promises, to negotiate honestly, and show respect for other points of view. So it was, in a way, you could say, I guess, related to security. Like, can I be sure that the other side will keep its promises? So in that sense, it was also, the result and the focus was guided also by the just the definition and then the theoretical approach to this, or the kind of trust we chose. And then, like, what would I like to see methodologically? I mean, it's not so much related to temporality aspects, but I'm very much a fan of triangulating, like quantitative and also qualitative and different qualitative methods. And I think it would be very useful, like we were struggling with this when we were looking at perceptions. Are we actually, documenting trust or not? Or like, how much proxy can you use? And when is it too much and you're just assessing something else? So this was also why sometimes we really ask, so did you trust what you say? You trusted at that particular point in time. And I think it would be really good where the data material exists to actually have it both ways, to first go in a more inductive fashion and ask about perceptions and then try to distill trust from these more general perceptions of the respective other side, and then perhaps combine with surveys and with direct questions. But I would argue it's also a matter really of how you organize the research process. I mean, it wouldn't make any sense to first confront my interviewee with a survey result on trust, or ask him or her directly, do you trust? And then later on try to open-endedly assess his or her perception of somebody. So it's also an issue of how I organize the empirical research, and not only the interviews, but the interviews in particular.
Thanks so much. Yeah, so actually when we thought about this panel about temporality, we thought a lot about how to develop trust research, not so much to make a specific argument about temporality, so that it has to be something specific when we talk about trust and temporality. So what we had in mind, first of all, was to take this seriously. So if trust is dynamic and relational, what does that mean in our particular context? So this is what Hannah and I did. So we come from specific research areas that have been going this way, disaggregating actors, relations, so on. So if we join these two analytical frameworks, different types of trust with different types of relations, and thinking that trust and distrust can coexist and are dynamic all the time, then this is a very complex analytical framework to fill. And to do this in research, and how to do this also speaks to your methodological question, right? I would argue from my field of expertise that we need to focus more on collective actors. So what we have in service is usually, the general population, and then we tend to focus on individual attitudes, right? But what about the collective level and the dynamics on it? So what I would like to do, if I get the funds, because indeed, as ABdalhadi said, it's you need resources for that. For instance, could be protest surveys, right? Surveys asking for trust games could be something to observe trust on the way, but absolutely, and I second you here, qualitative interviews, focus groups, either while unfolding, this is something that you could do when protests are on the way, and when you can really bring different sources together, including documents, etc. And I really like your approach, how to start openly and then kind of narrow it down, or confront interviews with surveys then at a later point. I think there's a lot of things that we could do. But still, I think it was really interesting how Jonas pushed us to think about the specific temporality of trust. And I think we saw this in other presentations as well, right? Quickly to lose, but hard to gain. It might take some time. But this makes our research so counterintuitive, right? Where does trust come from? That's exactly what ABdalhadi said. So, for instance, in my research on protests, so why do people suddenly trust each other? And not only against the common enemy. So this is the fascinating thing. In my research samples, I didn't have time to go into detail, but to go beyond social antagonisms. You can be against a ruling regime, against the president, so on, but that doesn't mean that you have to trust the other religion or the other ethnicity. So where does this suddenly come from? When it even translates into political demands that overcome a sectarian system, an ethnic divided society. So where does this trust come from? Counterintuitively and fast-paced. But this, again, of course, brings in the specific temporality of trust that I would definitely like to follow up. And then, of course, the question of the future is a very good one. And I think I haven't thought so much about it so far. Of course, it has about expectations about the future, right? And exactly this point of overcoming fears that, for instance, as you said, that the trust within a group is so high, so why do I get out of this group and then give up on their protection in a system that suddenly relies completely on political institutions I didn't trust before? This is something that we definitely need to investigate and, again, also take it into account when talking about temporality. And now the final word to Hannah.
Yeah. Looking at the time, I would simply use my time to actually thank everyone and say that I've made a lot of notes, taken a lot of notes. And I think that this experiment actually went quite well to get your perspectives on temporality on already existing research. So I'm deeply grateful for your inputs, but also for the great comment by Jonas, which gives us a lot of stuff to think about, and for all your participation. So thank you all very much for joining us on this panel.